don't know about you, but most of these sounds fill me with a dull dread. When I started climbing, you used to be able to head down to the Vickers Field in Pembrokeshire, and there was no problem with just switching your phone off. There wasn't any signal anyway. These days, I can check my emails and actually get work done at the crag. It's horrible. Over the past few months, we've got pretty used to one kind of isolation, and it's not the kind that climbers usually enjoy. We're so connected now, all the time, that the other kind of isolation is hardly possible, even way out in the mountains. And I quite like spending time on my own. In the past, I've had whole weekends soloing in the mountains by myself. But even on those crags, you're rarely totally isolated. I wanted to get some perspectives on that. Is it even possible to be totally isolated in the mountains these days? Out of contact, away from civilization? Is it even justifiable? On today's show, we've got two stories. From PLA d'Or recipient Tom Livingstone and mountain guide and expedition maestro Mike Twid Turner, who you might remember rescued a young Franco Cookson on Ben Nevis in a previous episode. You're listening to Factor 2 from UK Climbing. These are both stories about a time when being in contact in the mountains might have been useful. For Tom, the contact that was available was just enough. For Twid, he could have done with a little bit more. First up, Tom.
I just think that the climbing has this like anarchistic or a slightly rock and roll, do what we like type of attitude. And it certainly has a lot of strong characters in its history and a tradition of doing these sorts of not illegal but frowned upon activities. And it's very interesting to talk about that in the context of what we're going through at the moment, this whole stay inside corona crisis thing. And I'm not saying we should all discuss, is it okay to go outside? But it is interesting I think it's really important that, as Nick Bullock says, to kind of like protect the characters in climbing, to keep climbing soul going, to have this attitude of like, we're going to do it because it's fun and because we are thinking about what we enjoy most. That's everything that matters to us at this time. So we're going to get on a boulder route because we want to climb it, not because we're going to think of the consequences or what might happen, what may or might not go wrong. So I think it's really cool to try and keep climbing as this slightly wacky activity. Basically, you can be rescued from many places these days. I don't know if it's everywhere, but for example, in remote Pakistan. But it's annoying that it's changed my mind slightly, and now, like, I like going outside and going on expeditions without phones. I don't take my phone when I go tread climbing, for example, because it's nice to get away from everything. But then, is it irresponsible just to go to these places without any form of communication? And I guess the answer is yes, it's irresponsible. We should all be carrying them, because to not carry them is kind of negligent and inviting much worse consequences should you need to call a rescue. It's interesting, there was a really cool interview with Rollo Garibotti, who spends a lot of time in Patagonia. And one of the winters, I think it was last winter, they had a number of serious rescues, some of which were helped by people having communication devices, and others which were very serious because they didn't carry communication devices. And Rollo was saying, well, at least in Patagonia, you have to carry these things now. And so the mentality with climbing in the mountains there has changed. Same with if you're Leo Holding and you go to wherever they went in South America recently, he was doing, was it broadcasts from the wall, and got a helicopter to the top of this thing. I was just like, I didn't follow it, but I was like, wow, this is modern technology in action. It's certainly not for me, but it's really interesting to see. And yeah, I mean, I guess if you can bring that experience of climbing a big wall in South America to people's eyes and ears via modern technology, then great, why not? They're probably, people will be saying, this is fantastic, please keep sharing these sorts of things. Same with the idea of a rescue, I guess. It does just make me want to go climbing outside and just to turn off my phone. And I think that is like the epitome of what I enjoy in climbing. It's like the movement, the feeling, the being outside, being with good mates. I really enjoy that like connectedness that you get with other people, but it's just really interesting that I also just want to be like, okay, I'm going outside. I don't want anything to do with this because I can see it's fine for some people, but it's just not for me. So thanks very much and see you later. Weird. Yeah, it's funny. I was wondering if we were going to talk about like, okay, 159, and yeah, we'll talk about Das Hoover and Ben and Jerry and like, fucking yes, more climbing. And trad climbing and like Necky on sites and Pembroke. But instead we're talking about what does it mean to be a rebel in today's society?
I think this question of what's too much is always interesting in climbing. If you can be rescued from anywhere, that makes some places a lot more accessible. But it does seem to take away something from the point of exploring. If you've listened to this series, you might have got the measure of me as a fairly morbid individual. I'm a big fan of dystopian literature. One of my favourites is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. In it, society is presented as having two destinations. One is the technological utopia. The people are apparently happy, but no one's really free. In the other lie the savages, religious, riddled with illnesses, but appreciative of beauty and freedom. In one famous scene, John, born in savagery, tells the world state's leader, "I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom." Both worlds encapsulate a different kind of madness. Huxley said he regretted not presenting a third option, the one we all inhabit, where the boundaries are blurry, but real life exists. I sometimes wonder about this with climbing. Every time a new invention comes out and makes the sport a little safer, are we actually moving towards that insane utopia, removing all of the real adventure? But the flip side of this is deliberately accepting risk and avoiding things which could mitigate it, like we saw with Neil Gresham on the Indian Face in the last episode. That also seems like madness. Much as we want the isolation, being in touch can be pretty useful, especially if, say, you fall in a crevasse on the descent from a new route on Khoyo Zum in Pakistan. Pressing the button for a rescue looks like a pretty good choice then.
Came back home to my parents' place and like all the relatives were there at Christmas, and suddenly it was like not well, everyone was very interested in, oh, what have you been up to, sort of thing, but suddenly there was this thing that they also knew about, and it was an accident, and it was a negative portrayal of climbing rather than whatever you're doing is climbing and that's positive. There was suddenly this negative thing that they could be aware of. And of course, like, your family are very supportive and stuff, but they always would like give you a hug at the end and be like, be safe, and you're like, I am trying to be safe. But it was just like this like expectation that one day you'd have another accident, or like there's just that change of how people viewed you perhaps, and it's that effect on others that makes you, or really makes you, reel in the boldness. For example, of course I was aware of risk before, and actually probably my view of risk hasn't really changed. I think I'm quite, in some respects, cold and analytical about risk, but now I'm just aware that it's a bit more of a conversation, or it comes into my head once in a while as opposed to very infrequently. More like you've just seen the consequences of when things go wrong, and so suddenly you're like, right, this would be really annoying, or this would be very unfortunate to have an accident here. I guess, yeah, just the consequences of having an accident in the mountains are often lengthy and not very good. it was interesting because in Pakistan last year with Ali, that was the first time we'd climbed together, first time we'd properly climbed together anyway. So it was quite like a baptism of fire for the partnership. I think Ali's got a very strong head, both in terms of like mind, and thankfully he didn't get a worse head injury, because in the grand scheme of things it sounded like it was quite a minor head injury. Well, I don't know. It basically seemed like Ali has got a tough mind, a tough head, and so I was like very grateful for that. I just tend to like think about it and be like, oh well, it will really be bad to have an accident here. Let's try not to have an accident here. And okay, these are things we can deal with. These are things we can do if we do have an accident. So I just kind of process it and then move on, I guess. But I remember when Pete, Graham and Ben Sylvester went to the Revelation Mountains in Alaska, they said they set up their tent where the ski plane dropped them on the glacier. And then they were just like struck by the isolation, and they would like one day they'd ski a little bit and then come back to camp. And then the next day they'd ski a little bit further and then come back to camp, just like slowly expanding their comfort zones. And I don't know, yeah, maybe just because I've often gone with a really good partner like Ustian, for example, or my two Slovenian friends. But it just seems like we're kind of having fun and messing around, and well, not messing around, but you know, there's always this like light attitude or light atmosphere, and so you're like, well, okay, well, we're stuck in the middle of nowhere, but let's not have an accident, or let's try and avoid it, and worst comes to worst, we'll just call the ski plane and get the ski plane back. I remember being in my late teens, early 20s, and even walking up to Ben Nevis in winter, being like pretty scared about what could happen. We could fall off, or we could like some gear could rip and stuff like that. Just going in quite a weak mind, or whatever. I don't know, like quite a susceptible mind, and thinking of all the things that could go wrong, and definitely being intimidated by the scale of things. And I think I must have felt a bit of that in Alaska as well on my first trip. But now I guess perhaps it's just familiarization. You know, it's a bit like soloing. You'd never jump on a hard route on like solo it, but if you do a bunch of routes to warm up to it and you kind of get your head in the right space, then it's a possibility. So perhaps it's just being more familiar with the environment, or just knowing that I will feel isolated in wherever, if I go to one of these places. Once you know you're going to feel like that, then when you do feel like that, it isn't such a surprise, perhaps. It is easy to be like, well, let's view things in a positive way. Let's take every experience as a beneficial experience. But for sure, like when I've spent thousands of pounds and months of my life getting ready for something, and then you get there, and for whatever reason you aren't able to climb something, and you've lost racks worth of gear, and you've been training for ages, and you really want to do this thing, then it sucks, of course. Yeah, it would be you'd be painting it in the wrong light to say otherwise. But for sure, it's easy to also frame these things in the only way that we know, which is the fact that if you go to the top of something, then it's the end of the climb. Just like how Hazel was so close when she had that attempt on that go on Magic Line, and fell off like one move from the top or something. But still, we draw like the finish line, as it were, as the top of the route. So there's such a small difference between like dropping the last move and actually clipping the chains, but yet it's the thing that we define it by. Will Sim had asked myself, Ustian Hawthorne, Ali Swinton and John Crook if we'd be psyched to go to this relatively remote and unexplored area of northern Pakistan. And it's a cool idea to have loads of people in a base camp, so it's really sociable. You can all just have a laugh and all climb different things. So it's a really cool concept, and one that we'd all been talking about for ages, but it's very good of like cool of Will to get the whole thing off the ground. And you sort of know that with 5 people going to Pakistan, unfortunately some people are going to get sick because of the food or the water or just whatever. And actually the sort of schedule that you have to roughly stick by is to acclimatize quite a bit before you're able to go climbing. And so if you miss out 1 or 2 of those bits of acclimatization, then unfortunately you're sort of not quite in the best shape for going for whatever you want to do. For example, it's just in your mind. So that's why basically when it came down to it, we were all camped underneath Khoyo Zom, and Ali and I wanted to climb this really cool looking thing on the right hand side, the northwest face. It did look like it would be very tricky and quite a slim chance of success, but this was the thing that I was originally motivated by when I saw the photo that Will sent me maybe 8 months before we actually went to Pakistan. So this was the line, this was the thing that stood out as looking, in my eyes, pretty cool. And unfortunately, because Will, Usjan and John, they'd all had their own different thoughts, and unfortunately had missed out on bits of the acclimatization schedule just because they'd been a bit unlucky. They went for the left-hand side of Khoyo Zom, and I guess it's more like at the northeast ridge, and it did look pretty gnarly, but hopefully it looked a bit more amenable or would allow them to acclimatize a bit en route. And as Will rightly said, he'd had 3 trips to the Himalaya, or to the sort of that region, the greater ranges, and he'd kind of been shut down on the first 2. So he sort of said, well, it's just nice to try and climb something. So it did look like a good option for those guys. That's kind of how it all came about. It kind of looked like you would basically stack maybe 1 or 2 of Gogarth main cliff. So that's like 90 meters, so 180 meters of amazing, pretty overhanging rock and little bits of ice and stuff. Stack 2 of those on top of each other, and that was the head wall that Ali and I were kind of gunning towards. So we were pretty uncertain about how we'd be able to get through that, and so we thought there was a good chance that we could get through it somehow, but whether it took us like 3 days or 6 days to get through this thing, we weren't really sure. That's one of the things that drew us towards it, though, was the uncertainty and the fact that wouldn't it be cool to get that technical difficulty, that like technical rock climbing and ice climbing and everything all mixed together, get that from sea level at Gogarth, and then punch that to like 6,000 meters, and suddenly you're like having to climb tricky moves. That's basically what attracts me most to climbing, or one of the things that attracts me to climbing, is that technical difficulty. Take hard climbing at sea level, but then take it and put it at altitude is just really cool, I think. And so we were pretty psyched just to like give it a go and see if it would work out. We had quite a few of these like lines traced on the wall in our heads, but when we got there, it was like immediately apparent that, oh, okay, that like massive corner system that's above us is like 300 meters high, and it's all overhanging, and it kind of looks a bit weird and steep. That will take us like a week to get up that. We don't have that long, so let's go like round the corner where there's a much easier corner system. So quite often we were like, ducking and diving, just seeing what we could see. But then it was very lucky that we managed to find this like subtle weakness through the like meat of the head wall, in order to get to the like more slabby, easier ground. Going through this head wall, finding this like really subtle weakness, was absolutely mega. It was lucky, or as good as the climbing has got for me in the mountains, because I had my rock shoes on, and it was really, really good rock, amazing position, like really, really wild, just like Gogoth. So it's steep, but with pretty good gear and good holds. You're at 6,200 meters. The sun's come round right in the afternoon, evening. You're actually rock climbing, and you're like danger crimping in sunshine with like kind of warm hands for an hour or so, and you could kind of get 3D bridged and wiggle out a little rock or a little stone, and then just drop it, and it would go all the way down to the glacier, like hundreds of meters below. So it just felt really, really surreal, really cool. And of course, every time you do some like tricky moves, you'd be pumped and breathing hard because of the altitude. So I did pull on some bits of gear for sure. Then following up this like really cool little groove system in order to get to the easier ground. Yeah, it just felt wild. Felt really cool to be doing hard rock climbing, but in the middle of nowhere in Pakistan, and then behind you, literally the other side of the valley from base camp, is Afghanistan, and behind that is China. We only had one like text sat phone sort of thing. It's a Garmin InReach, so you can only text. So we took that, and Will, John, and Ushchan just had a sat phone, but that was unable to connect to anyone and couldn't receive any messages. So we were really basically out of communication. And one of the reasons why they bailed after 5 or 6 days or something was because the climbing was very tricky and they were feeling ill, but also because they thought bad weather was coming in on their sat phone, and the sat phone wasn't receiving updated messages. But yeah, it's good not to think too much about things. But basically we saw their footsteps we couldn't see their footsteps going from where we knew they'd started climbing. So they obviously hadn't got to the top. So we just knew they'd gone down, and hopefully they'd gone down safely. You know, they're like a strong team of 3. So we assumed they'd bailed and were back in base camp. We'd always thought we could wrap the line that we'd climbed up on the northwest face, but once we'd actually climbed it, it turned out to be not a very nice proposition. It probably would have lost like racks and racks worth of gear and would have been quite tricky. So we decided to go down the east face, like the east side of the mountain. It's only ever been climbed twice, about 50 years ago, and up the east side, which is like much easier snow. So we thought that will be a pretty quick way to go down. It doesn't take us back down to where we want to go directly, but it's still a viable option. So that's what we did from the top. We dropped down the east side and got to a nice flat glacier after doing some like down climbing and rappelling and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And landed back on a nice flat glacier, which we knew would eventually take us all the way kind of winding back down to base camp. And we had to lose a lot of altitude, so we were still really high, and it looked like a really gnarly glacier, you know, loads of crevasses, and so you'd have to like wind your way through a maze. But in theory, it's just walking. We've done all the climbing and we've come down most of the way down the other side of the mountain. And so yeah, the next day we just had to walk down. Hopefully it would just take one really long day. Yeah, so I think we're now on the 6th climbing day. In the morning we woke up pretty tired, but pretty psyched to get back down to base camp to eat fried pakora, which are these like amazing potato vegetable delicious things that our cook was making all the time. We roped up and started walking down the glacier, and then unfortunately we were kind of weaving our way down through these crevasses, and it was a bit gnarly. But in a kind of an unlucky accident, Ali fell down into one of the crevasses and rattled down a little bit, and then I was able to stop him with the rope and haul him out, and he was bashed up quite a bit. He'd cut his head, which I couldn't really see how badly it was, but it looked like quite a long, deep cut. And I know head injuries bleed quite a bit, but I also know the kind of things you want to get checked out. And I think he'd also hit his arm, and he had like a really bad dead leg. I was a bit worried that there'd be some sort of bone sticking out of his leg, so I like checked the thigh, but actually it seemed to be totally fine. Just like a massive dead leg. Yeah, I kind of thought, well, we could potentially get down somehow. Like we could walk down the glacier, but Ali couldn't really walk, so I could kind of like drag him. But then if I fell into a crevasse, could he then get me out again? And would more exercise make the head wound worse? I knew we were in a very remote region of Pakistan and still quite high, so helicopters might not be able to fly much higher than our altitude because of the pressure of the air. And so we had a quick think, but it did seem like even if we just made it back down to base camp with Ali in his current condition, it was important that he got medical attention, or better than what I could give him anyway. So that's when I pressed the SOS button on the InReach, the texting device we'd carried. And I was sort of imagining you open this little cap and you press the SOS, and it's like, Team America arrive and there's helicopters, and it's like, we're going to get you guys out of there. But instead, it's like nothing happens for a second. And I'm like, is this thing even working? And then a message just comes through and it's like, are you sure? And it's like, yes, pressing this thing again and again. Yeah, I'm kind of sure. We were under the impression that the helicopters, the Pakistani army, could rescue us quite quickly. But due to a number of logistical errors and miscommunications and things like that, we waited during the first day. And like I said, Ali's got a very tough head, so he was in quite a bit of pain and doing okay, but he was conscious throughout everything. Then by the afternoon, sort of as night was falling and the temperatures were dropping, it was like, the helicopters are definitely not coming today. So that was a bit gripping, because I'd kind of put the tent up and put Ali in the sleeping bag throughout the day, but then it was like, right, well, we're actually going to have to spend the night here, which is not our idea of fun, because all we wanted to be doing was eating fried pakora in base camp. And so I put the tent up properly and got into our stinking double sleeping bag, which we'd been using for quite a while. I have limited medical experience, but I knew his head was no longer bleeding, and so I knew that he wouldn't sort of like bleed out or anything like that. But I also knew that people can die of stress or shock, I suppose, and I guessed he might have been going through both. I suppose the real indication was that his condition deteriorated quite a lot in the first half of the night. That was, yeah, a bit gripping. But then, thankfully, through lots of like keeping him warm and asking him loads of shit questions, by the sort of early hours of the morning, he was in pretty good shape. Yeah, I just did everything that I'm sure Ali would do for me and that we would all do for our mates, and just try to keep him talking and keep talking to him and keep him warm. We didn't really have any water and we had a few bars left, so just like give him what little we had and just look after him throughout the night. It was a bit gripping at times because of the altitude. You lose your natural breathing rhythm, and so you'll almost pause for half a breath but then have to do a really deep breath just because your body's like, whoa, I need air right away. And so Ali would sort of slow down into this breathing rhythm, and then I'd be waiting for his breath and I'd give him a nudge because nothing would happen. I'd be like, Ali, breathe. But yeah, anyway, it was like a very long night. I was really grateful to have the texting phone because Ruth Bevan, so this is John's wife was a doctor and was really, really helpful in giving me medical advice. And John Griffith was kind of coordinating everything and keeping us really motivated, or keeping us optimistic. It's important, I guess, to remember that just because someone says they can contact you in Pakistan and they can, in theory, rescue you, doesn't mean that they will be able to. Ali and I were waiting for something like 28 hours or something for these helicopters to arrive, and probably eventually they would have, but if it's a time pressure situation, if Ali was any worse, I would have been very concerned, or even more concerned, I suppose. The helicopters in Pakistan, for example, just as a funny story, they take a regular helicopter and then they basically remove the engine and soup it up. They like change all the gear ratios so that this helicopter will be able to fly in such high velocity with the rotors so that they can generate enough lift just to fly at altitude. And they said that this is basically not a sensible thing to do for a helicopter. If this was a car, they'd be like, do not drive this car. But because of the environment that it's operating at, they need to basically like tear up the rule book on how a helicopter should work. And then somehow it'll be able to fly in these higher altitudes. So it's not exactly like a super safe thing. And there's always 2 helicopters that fly in Pakistan in the mountains. And I said, when we got down, why have you got 2? And they said, well, if first helicopter crashes, second helicopter is new rescue helicopter. And you're like, oh, great.
There's a whole new can of worms here about what lengths people should go to rescue you. In Tom's case, it was relatively straightforward, and he would like to point out that this is the only time he's been rescued, and he intends to keep it that way. For a more troubling case, it's worth reading Bernadette MacDonald's excellent book on Thomas Humar, who was plucked from the Rupal face in Nanga Parbat in 2005. And it was only due to his government connections that the rescue was enacted at all. Anyway, on to a more light-hearted tale.
Hello.
Hello. Twid Turner started sharing some of his expedition stories on Facebook during lockdown, so I got in touch to ask him about one of them, an early trip to Alaska. He and Stuart McAleese ended up stranded at the Kachatna Spires for more than 2 weeks, going slowly crazy.
I quite like the isolation. You know, for me, the classic one is Patagonia. Everybody wants to go to Patagonia. They all think about going to Shoal 10. And really what they're doing is they're going sports climbing around Shoal 10 and going and drinking beer and eating pizzas. And then the weather goes good and they all run to the hills, goes climbing. Well, that to me is that's like going to Spain or Greece. You know, for me, I like going and being in the mountains and absorbing that kind of the wilderness and the kind of remoteness and just feeling like it's you in the mountains. Then you make decisions based on how you feel, the group, the weather, the route. And it's a very different kind of experience. And it's quite nice being cut off. So I don't like it when you're really connected. And I think it changes the dynamics of what you're doing, changes your decision making. And also I think people, they don't detach from their kind of home life. They stay connected. And then all that baggage stays with you instead of actually sort of like trying to put all that kind of what's happening at home on the shelf for a bit and then just focus on the climbing. Yeah, for me, I like that remote feeling and being almost cut off. It definitely helps. You know, I was a mountain guide and people would come to the Alps and you'd sort of go into the mountains and there'd be, you know, most of the time you didn't have phone signal. In fact, we didn't have mobile phones. You know, there's no internet. And now people, they get stressed if they go to an alpine hut and they don't have internet or the phone signal. And it's like, you know, it's kind of like having another person with you that's there that isn't there. And I see I see people, they can't disconnect. It's not that they have to be connected. It's just that they're kind of addicted to it. And it's like society sort of like made people reliant on a technology. It's really interesting. It's quite rare that people just like to just completely like just switch off. And I've seen it with a lot of young people. They're so connected with social media that they struggle to kind of like stop in being involved with that they're kind of like their life on social media and actually interact with the people you're with. They sort of like, instead of actually perhaps coming out, say, for a night, having a beer or something and socializing, they'll think, oh no, I'm going to sort of, go and do my Facebook things. It's really taken over, I think. It's society. It's definitely changed. I mean, I was away in Brazil and, a load of old school boys with Simon Naden and Sean Hudson and Alan, and we were like, oh, great, being climate. Come on, let's go and have a drink, a pizza. And then some of the other boys are like, sort of like, wow, I need to socialize and sort of do my social media thing. And it's kind of, it's weird, it's kind of it's as if sort of society's lost that ability to communicate directly. People want adventures. I think people want adventures. I think it's what if people go away and they have an adventure and it's memorable and it's meaningful, then that's what the sport's about. I think the problem is now, I think society is forcing people to collect things, to collect routes, grades, mountains, whatever, and actually the whole kind of experience gets a bit lost. For me, it's actually, it's going there and experience it. That's what it's about. I mean, it's great to read about other people's sort of experiences because it's a motivator for me to then go and do my own things. But I kind of feel sometimes we're just notching up things just to sort of to say what we've done, and a bit soulless in some ways. It's all, basically, when you're a baby crawling around, you're exploring. You think, oh, what's in the next room? You crawl in the next room. It's like that instinct's there with us. The social media sort of net is just sort of focusing us on sort of collectibles rather than actually just collecting certainly sort of having emotional sort of experiences which are feels really meaningful. Having an expedition in some ways where you are cut off is I think is really good. I mean, I think it's healthy. I think people kind of almost sort of find themselves. Well, I've been going to Pakistan a lot in the 1990s and having lots of really frightening things. And we'd been on Greater Trango with my wife and Steve Long, Steve Mayers, and we'd had an absolute epic, proper epic, really frightening. Virtually we were almost all killed. I mean, it was, we were climbing for 2 months, it was a big deal. And my wife, who'd done all the trips with Louise, I think she's just sort of burnt out from that fear. So I was sort of looking for something easy, and Alaska sort of seemed the place to go. And, you literally can just sort of organise a trip like there and then. It's brilliant. So off we went. I didn't know an awful lot about Alaska other than flying in, and I'd sort of, we'd sort of over prepared in some ways. And we sort of chopped and changed our itinerary. We were going to originally go into sort of the Hess Range, and we decided in the end to go to Kachatnas. It's the big sort of rock walls, which really sort of grabbed our attention. And just the two of us flew in there, and we sort of landed on the Shadows Glacier and spent a month in there climbing. The whole trip was around about 5 weeks, and we'd sort of tend to go in. It takes a bit of time getting into these places. You can only fly in with good weather. They will only fly into the Kachatnas. It's about an hour's flight with visibility from Talkeetna. So if the pilot, in our case Paul Roderick, if he could see the mountains, he'll go for it. So it takes a bit of time to get in. And once you're in there, then you sort of, it's not easy getting out because again they'll only come if they can fly in good viz. So you have to go in and then give them they say at least 3 or 4 days to get picked up. So if you're going to go for say 2 weeks, you need a 3-week trip, a 3-week weather window. And we had in the end like a 4-week block in the mountains. We had a couple of other friends who were going to go into the Kachatnas later on after a couple of weeks. And Paul Roderick said that if he drops these other guys and these American climbers in, that he'll come and find us. And if we're ready, he'll pick us up. So we kind of thought after 2 weeks, there's a potential pickup. And we had amazing weather. We just landed on the glacier. It was just stunning weather, perfect weather for the whole time. So we did a brilliant route, a big wall route on the cathedral, got down, and then we thought, great, in a couple of days, Paul Roderick's going to fly in with Jim Danini and Jack Tattle, and we'll have a beer and then we'll fly out. But of course, the weather was bad at the other end, and we were in good weather, and they just didn't arrive. And we ended up just waiting and waiting, and we didn't have any comms, so we actually had a sat phone with us, but it just didn't work. So we're just sort of waiting, assuming the next day the plane will come. So one day turns into 2 days, and then 2 days eventually turned into 15 days. So we were waiting for 15 days for a plane to come. You start looking at your food and you're thinking, we've just eaten a month's worth of food and no one's come to pick us up. I wonder if they're actually going to come and pick us up. It is interesting being sort of in a remote place and not sure about, it adds a very different dimension. I mean, probably the biggest epic I've had is in Baffin. It was the second time I was there with Mark Thomas and Stuart McAleese. We'd done this route, and we'd been on the wall. We had 24 days on the wall in Ledger, so it was really, it was a big deal. We were bollocksed. We got down, and the weather had been pretty bad, and then the weather suddenly went quite nice. It was enough that it melted all the water. It melted the fjord, so the fjord went from being bullet-hard ice, where the skidoos and the Inuit could come and collect you, to just being mush, so they couldn't drive the skidoo on it. So we kind of waited a day or two. We realised they just weren't going to come and pick us up. So we ended up having to escape. And we spent a couple of days walking down this fjord in wellies. We took Wellingtons, luckily, so we could wade down this sort of mush to another field, the Sand Fjord, where we thought, well, there's probably more chance we might be found in this place. We lost everything, lost all our gear. We just had survival kit, like tent and a stove and a rifle and a bit of food. And that did feel really remote. But but saying that, we had a sat phone. And eventually, I couldn't get through to the outfitter in Clyde River to come and pick us up. But I got through to my wife, and she was showing a load of sort of potential parents around the school where she works in Switzerland. And this phone call came up, and she sort of had to ask one of the parents for a pen. And I sort of gave her a grid reference, and I said, look, we're at this, the Walker Arm in the Sand Fjord. And there's all these parents look at my wife and says, oh, my husband's lost in the Arctic. I've just got to go and ring the rescue. And apparently they're all like really impressed. I thought, like, where do we sign up for our kids? And she then rang through to into Baffin to the Inuit, and then they knew where we were, and then eventually sort of came and picked us up. But that did feel quite out there. From an isolation point of view, we as we were getting dragged in there, we met an American climber, and he was solo climbing on Scott Island. And we arrived, and this guy comes out of the tent, and man, he'd lost it. He'd properly lost it. You look at someone, I think, shit, mentally, he's really fucked. And so I sort of said to the Joshua, who's the main outfitter, said, look, this guy's he's not mentally stable. He's lost it. He shouldn't be climbing. And the Inuit just said, well, it's up to him. And we kind of left this guy, and we got sort of dragged into our fjord and went climbing. But I do know that on the way back, they went back for this guy, and they literally hauled him out. They said, right, you're out. And they just dragged him out of the tent. So kind of isolation is good, but also it can be bad, particularly in the mountains. It can play on people's minds. It affects them, and changes how they work as a climber, and also mentally, how they deal with the stresses. We actually had a sat phone with us, but it just didn't work. Bizarrely, I'd sort of hired it from Jagged Globe because I didn't know and I didn't have one. I didn't know anything about it, so I got in touch with Simon Lowe, a friend of mine who runs Jagged Globe, and Simon said, "Look, hire one of ours." And I picked it up from Sheffield, and in the kind of the heat of picking it up, we hadn't properly checked it was working. We tried it at the office, and I got sort of bundled out with this thing, and it's like, "Oh yeah, it's fine, don't worry," and it just didn't work. I forget what it was. It was kind of really old. I mean, this is going back, 20 years ago. It wasn't on an Iridium system, which is the best system for that in the Northern Hemisphere, in North America especially. Iridium works well. They've got satellites overhead, whereas is it Globalsat? They have more kind of satellites circling around the kind of the equator, so the angle's low, so it doesn't always pick them up. So eventually we did get a signal, but we could hear people, but they couldn't hear us. We were getting pretty stressed, and at one point Stuart Macleese is holding this kind of dish above his head, and I'm sort of like ringing, and eventually I ring through his girlfriend, Amanda. And she sort of picks the phone up. Well, she didn't pick the phone up. A bloke picks the phone up, but we kind of realised it was like 2:00 in the morning. So Stuart's sort of holding this dish up in the middle of this glacier, and he said, "Who's that? Who's that?" And I thought, I don't know. It was a bloke on the end of the phone, and it wasn't Amanda. So Stuart got a bit grumpy and sort of like stormed off down the glacier for a day. I didn't see him, thinking it's. Anyhow, it was just a friend who was staying. It was purely, it was a very innocent sort of thing. Our original idea was to go over a col and climb something else from the Shadows Glacier in Kachatna's Spires. But the cols are super loaded and are really avalanche prone, so we decided not to bother. And we sort of literally stopped below this beautiful pillar on this mountain, and we didn't really... we hadn't even thought about this peak, but it was like, wow, let's do that. And it's just there, and it was brilliant. To get onto it, you had to got some steep snow and cross a bit of a gully, and then you got to this big wall, and we sort of like we hauled a portledge up there. And we just generally had a nice time climbing, hanging out on the face. What I will say is that we had a very close shave on the approach. We were sort of hauling a load of kit up to the base, and we both got a bit spooked with the temperature. And then sort of the state of the snow, and we just got to this point. Thought we're going to turn around and go down. We'll come back later when it's colder. And by the time we sort of slid down this slope, just a matter of minutes, we got to the bottom. We turned around, and the whole thing had avalanched. So gut feeling and the experience there, like saved our bacon. We would have definitely been in that avalanche. So it did feel quite hazardous. But once we're on the rock, it's easier and it's safer. I think we had about a week up there, from memory. We sort of had a portaledge camp and a bivvy, and it just takes time. You get some pictures. You might just do one picture a day sometimes because of the technical difficulty of it. It can be quite slow, big wall climbing. People sort of seem to think you do hundreds of meters each day. It's not always the way. Yeah, it's funny. At the time, earlier that year, I'd climbed the nose with Louise in a day. And then we're sort of big wall climbing, and it's like, inching your way up. It was good. It was good crack, actually. It was great fun. It's a beautiful wall. It's first been climbed by, I think, Andy Embick and a few other Alaskan climbers, and they'd done a sort of a route further right. And we ended up sort of joining the top of their route high up. We didn't know this at the time, but eventually I found a pit up like really high up and thought, fucking hell, someone's been here. But the chunk of our route was a new route. It's really remote. You go to Alaska. I've done 15 trips to Alaska, and you go to Alaska and you're in Talkeetna where everyone's sort of bouncing out to go into the mountains. Most people go into Denali to climb Denali. They're all going, oh, you're the mountain. And I go, well, in Alaska, there's thousands of mountains. And you talk to lots of experienced climbers, and they've never been to the Kachatnas. It's like it's a bit like saying, oh, you're a rock climber in Lake District, but you've never been to Glencoe. But you think at some point you might go to Glencoe. But they just don't go out there. It's just got this sort of aura about it of bad weather and conditions. It just keeps people away. After 3 weeks, we started getting into our kind of pickup period where they said, oh, we'll come and pick you up. And in the end, they came in on the last possible day that they could have. So basically, when you give the pilots a date, said, well, we want to pick up earliest on this date, and our last day is this date. And he literally came in at midnight on the last day that we could actually get picked up and then catch your flight home. We were looking at, to be honest, we were sort of looking at walking out, which is real epic. Another day or two, we were sort of literally just going to try and pack up and walk out from the Kachatnas. But you can't walk out to civilization. You walk out for about a week and eventually get to a disused mine where I think there's a telephone and there's a possibility that you might be able to flag down a plane. But it's a pretty it's quite a big deal. You can't get across the rivers. There's massive rivers coming out of the mountains, so it's just not possible to walk out to a Pizza Hut. You have to flatten the snow for them to create a runway, not for the landing, it's for the taking off. So they got a bit of pressure they can push down on the harder snow. So during our sort of lockdown period for 15 days waiting for pickup, we built the best runway they've ever seen in Alaska. So it was like, oh, we'd had everything. Well, we were pretty desperate. We'd even got this bad that we'd piled any cardboard we had in a little pile. And if a plane went overhead, and every day a plane would go overhead, but it'd be kind of like thousands of meters above us. It would set this cardboard off and would sort of wave, and we had SOS stamped out in the snow. Just hoping somebody might see something. But I mean, no one's going to see that from high up. I think even if you're in a small plane, you're flying quite low over the glacier, it's hard to see it. That was amazing. I mean, we were actually going a bit crazy. I mean, we called a route off the wall bonkers because we were kind of slightly losing it. We were constantly listening for like slight whine, like a little wasp whine of the Cessna plane coming in. And we sort of like sit up, do you hear that? Oh, I can hear it. And of course there wasn't anything. We called it Cessna ear. So we were lying, we'd given up for this day. The tent was about 2 meters above the glacier. It was on this mound of snow. And so the tent was on top of this mound of snow. And the glacier had melted all around us. It was just bizarre. And we were lying there about midnight, and we heard this this whine. And we thought, oh, God, yeah, it's just Cessna ear. And the next thing, it got louder and louder. And then literally, Paul Roderick flew just a few meters above the tent. The tent just was virtually taken off. We were fucking out of that tent as fast as you could imagine. It was like Thunderbirds. Boom, we were into our mountaineering boots. And by the time Paul had circled around and he landed, we were like, the tent was down, we were out of there. And, we were like, obviously we must have had big eyes, and Paul laughed, and we got into the plane and we flew out, and it just sort of happened, he arrived and we were gone. It was like 20 minutes, it was just so fast. And we flew into Talkeetna, and the World Cup was on. And we went into the Fairview, which is this brilliant old pub in Talkeetna. And England were playing on a telly above the bar. I know, of course, Americans aren't paying much interest to the football, but we were right into it. And we stayed there all night drinking. And sort of, I think we went back to this bunkhouse where we were staying about 7 o'clock in the morning with a hideous hangover the next day. Yeah, that was it. Flew home. Another good trip.
All's well that ends well, I guess. You've been listening to Factor 2 from UK Climbing. I'm Will Treasure. Thanks for listening. Factor 2 is now on Instagram, factor.2, or you can find us on Facebook as well. Thanks.